Listen, man, welcome to the Great Northeast BJJ podcast. Super stoked to have you. Big thanks to our friend Dave McGinnis for, he's like, man, you want to have Henry on the podcast? I was like, yeah, of course, dude. I'm George. I've never met you, but I've heard a lot of great things about you. This is my partner, Jay. Welcome to the podcast, brother.
Thanks for having me on, guys.
Heck yeah.
Absolutely. So how are things on the West Coast these days?
Well, I'm in Vegas now. So I moved out to Las Vegas, God, probably almost a year ago. And man, Vegas is one of those cities that's like a boom or bust town. And, when economic disasters hit, like this town just gets crushed. So I did a little YouTube or like a little Facebook video the other day driving down the strip of Las Vegas Boulevard. And it's literally like a ghost town here. It's crazy. It's eerie because, you always think about the strip. There's always people out. There's millions of people all over the place. And literally you're driving down and, you're driving for a mile and you see maybe 10 people, which is kind of crazy. It reminded me that kind of like that scene in that Will Smith movie, I Am Legend, where he's walking around like a major city and there's just like no one around. It's kind of like that.
Yeah, man, that's a good point. It's the city that never sleeps. Probably the best example of how COVID has affected people is in that city where the streets are packed no matter what hour, like 4 o'clock in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, 1 o'clock, and like there's people all the time. And that's probably the biggest contrast that you could maybe find in the country, I think.
Yeah, they say it's basically like the epicenter of the financial, like what's being crushed because, it's all service industry, right? And it's all based on tons of people coming out. Like now the weather's getting hot. We just had our first 100 degree day out here. And, usually pool parties are starting to pop off right now and everything's just crushed. So nobody's working. It's pretty crazy. You'd never imagine that there would be something that would come along in our lifetime that would shut down the city, the whole city of Vegas. There would just be no one coming in.
Right. I would have never thought. I haven't experienced something like this before. And we've gone through, we had the bird flu thing come through.
Ebola.
Yeah. But it wasn't like this. It wasn't, hey man, don't go outside. You might kill yourself or somebody else. Man, those are harsh stakes and it's affected a lot of people. And I think mentally is maybe the biggest change that we're all trying to deal with. Like, how do you encapsulate this? How do you keep yourself sane during this time?
Yeah. It's like jiu-jitsu. You got to go with the flow,
Right. Control what you can, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like this is the situation you're given. And now how do you make the best of it? How do you find comfort in the uncomfortable?
You just got your guard passed, knee on stomach. They're looking for chokes. How do we survive? Hey, question for you. Given that, and we'll go way back into the, go back to the beginning of Henry Akins. But are you doing like the online thing right now? The reason I ask specifically is because so much of, the concept. One of the big concepts that you teach is about the connection, right?
Mm-hmm.
And solo drills and stuff like that. There is no connection. There's not another person, right? Do you buy into what people are trying to do to keep people involved in jiu-jitsu or?
Well, absolutely. So I've had a website now for the last 4 years where I've been releasing content, releasing all of the footage from like all the seminars I do. I record my seminars and I release that online. And so one of the things I over the last few years, I've noticed, because for me too, I was always very skeptical about putting stuff on video, and Rickson was always too. He was always of the mindset that you have to feel it. But the feedback that I've gotten over the last 4 years is that you can actually provide a great amount of value if you can articulate yourself well enough and if you can demonstrate. So you're always going to be missing that extra element of the kinesthetic feel. But when students are learning, we basically use 3 different mediums. We use the audio, the visual, and the kinesthetic, the feel of what's going on to be able to pick up jiu-jitsu. And so I think if you can do a good enough job articulating what you're trying to pass on and you can kind of show in depth and detail, I think you can pass on a lot of information. And so I definitely think right now, obviously, video is probably the best way to transfer knowledge. with the circumstances that we're dealing with right now. And so I know people are trying their best, and I know a lot of schools have gone to that format where they're trying to do classes online. In regards to what you mentioned about solo drills, I mean, the solo drills is mostly, I think that stuff is really, really helpful in keeping someone in shape, right? You're never going to get with jiu-jitsu, so much of it is timing and feeling and reacting to your opponent's movements. So you're going to lose out on that aspect of reacting to a specific movement or a kind of a signal that they're giving you based on, a way they move or the way they react. So you're going to miss out on that. But I think keeping in shape and also developing the correct movement patterns will be extremely. So I think you can, in this time where people are not so much training, I think you can come back a better practitioner if you do certain things to kind of keep up with your daily practice.
So I was just thinking about kind of what you're saying, because we just started doing some online like drills sort of stuff for our students. And I think that in teaching, I've taught a couple, Jay's taught a couple, but like setting it up to teach, I had to really like think about the stuff in a different way than I've normally had when there's another person you're doing it with. And then even when you're trying to do like a movement, I feel like you have to really think about it more maybe when you're doing it. And so it has been helpful to me.
Yeah. When you're doing the movements by yourself, without having someone else laying on top of you or someone else, you can really kind of focus on how to properly do the movement effectively. So many times you'll do a movement in class or in training, for example, with an unresisting opponent. But then when you try to do it in live action, you always mess up on it because there's so many other things going on through your mind. You're not able to kind of focus just specifically on that movement and how you're supposed to execute that movement the most effective way or the most efficient way. And so I definitely think doing these movements by yourself where you're in an environment where there's no resistance can definitely be helpful. The other thing with, I think, practicing these movements too is, in jiu-jitsu, we use so many different body movements that we never use in any other thing we do in life, right? We're using our legs, we're using our arms and putting our body in all these crazy different movements and directions. And so I think with the solo movements, it really helps your body to develop the muscles that are going to help you execute those movements, because those are just not movement chains that you use in daily life.
Right. And I think to that point, it's been a tremendous challenge for strength and conditioning coaches to try to get with, improved jiu-jitsu athletes, because yeah, sure. Like, will squatting help you? Will bench press help you? Will, doing all these, the burpees and Turkish get-ups, will it help? Yeah. But like, jiu-jitsu is so unique in the way that it uses the body. I think it's very tricky to coach, to train an elite athlete to get stronger, more fit for jiu-jitsu.
Yeah. I mean, there's just so many movements that you have to, I think with every sport, they want to be extremely specific to the movements. And with jiu-jitsu, there's just so many movements out there. With each technique, it's a different way of moving the body, a different way of applying that. People have a very, very difficult time. How do you train someone specifically to develop those muscles that they're going to be using? So I can definitely see and understand why that becomes a more difficult thing. I know a lot of people use kettlebells, and the last 15 years have been all about functional training. But with jiu-jitsu, it's really interesting how we use the body. And a lot of people say the best training for any sport is basically just doing the sport, right? Training. Sure. But you also have to understand how to do it in an intelligent way where you're not burning and breaking down your body. And there's different ways to break up the training so that you can develop the high level of skill without tearing down the body.
Awesome. So George, you want to do the origins thing?
Well, let me this has been really, I've been thinking about this, and yes, Jay knows I always go back to the beginning. I'm like, where were you born? And I think you were born in Vietnam, right?
Yeah, I was born in Vietnam.
Yeah. But
I was not there very long. It was during the war, actually at the end of the war. So I wasn't there very long. I was there for just a few weeks. And, my mom went back to try to get her family out. It was the end of the war. And she went out to try to get her family out, and she was pregnant with me at the time. And my dad had told her not to go back because, things were kind of looking bad. But she went back anyways. We were able to get her whole immediate family out, like my grandparents and her brothers and sisters. But she ended up having me while she was over there.
Dude, that's pretty crazy.
Yeah. I have an older brother and a younger brother, and they were both born in the United States, but I was born there in Vietnam. So.
How'd your mom end up in the United States?
My dad, she met my dad. She used to work for the airlines, and she met my dad while she was working for the airlines. And yes, they just end up, being together. And that's pretty much the story. My dad used to work for a book publishing company called McGraw-Hill. And at the time, it was one of the largest book publishing companies in the world. They do textbooks for all the schools. And so he was traveling all around Southeast Asia, and that's how they met.
Man, for all you millennials out there watching, McGraw-Hill, when we actually had physical textbooks and we would go to school and had social studies and history and stuff, they made all the books. Yeah.
Those books that you would pay $400 for, and then when you try to return them at college, you get $40 for those books. You cracked open your book maybe 5 times, and then you return the book and you get 40.
When you guys were young in school, did you have to make the book covers out of like paper grocery bags?
What do you mean when I was young? I'm still young.
I'm old, man.
No, that's exactly what we used to do. We used to do the covers with brown paper bags.
Did you do that, Jay?
I contest that I could do it today if I had to. I know the mechanics.
Right? So, but did you grow up in Oklahoma?
Well, I grew up on the East Coast for a few years, but I went through high school in Oklahoma. So I did quite a bit of my high school years were in Oklahoma. So I guess that's where a lot of us do a lot of our growing up. But I lived in LA for most of my life. I moved to LA when I was like 19, 20 years old. Just after I turned 20, I basically moved to LA to train with Rickson. So, yeah.
How did you know about Rickson?
Man, Gracie in Action 1 and 2. So there was that fight with Zulu, but then also, in the Gracie in Action films, they talk about Rickson being the best of all the brothers. And so I'm like, shoot, if I'm going to go out there and train, if I'm going to take this chance and commit myself to doing this, I might as well go out and learn with the best, right? And see why he's so different. Because, when they would talk about him being the best, it wasn't by a small margin. It was by a huge margin. And so it's like, well, something different's going on with this guy than the other guys. Why is this guy so much better? So that was a huge fascination, and that was a huge fascination for me. Well, like, okay, well, what makes this dude so much better than everyone else?
So he went when you first came out, he wasn't the first academy that you found in LA, right?
Well, he was, but what happened was that their school was so hard to locate because have you ever saw the documentary Choke? Mm-hmm. Have you seen that documentary? Yeah. Well, the school was in a karate school. So they shared the space with the karate school, and where the karate school was located was behind a couple buildings. It was like a carpet building and some other stuff. And it was right next to like an old body shop. So it was in an industrial space way in the back that there was really like no signage for it. Right. And so it was difficult to find in that aspect where it wasn't like a storefront. And back then it was before the internet. Right. So you couldn't just Google Rickson Gracie Academy. And so what we did is we ended up calling the Gracie Academy to try to find, hey, is Rickson teaching there, or where is he teaching? Because we had heard he has his own school, just through the grapevine, asking around and stuff like that. We had heard he had his own school, but at that point there was a huge falling out between the brothers, right? Rickson had left. At one point they were all training and teaching together there, what we used to call the Torrance Academy, which was Jorge's school. And so he ended up leaving and doing his own school, and they didn't want to give out the information. They didn't want to give out the information of where he was teaching or where his school was. So,
right. Right. So go ahead, George. Sorry.
No. What? So when you showed up, when you found Rickson's, what was the class like at Rickson's at that time? Who was was he Rickson teaching?
So, gosh, the first day how it originally happened was I was on, I think it was like a Thanksgiving break or spring break, right? It was a break from school. And I was like, I'm going to go out to LA and try to train. Took us a couple days to be able to find the school after, going through the yellow pages, calling around, trying to find. Eventually, my aunt, who I was staying with on break, had a personal trainer who had a friend who trained at the school. So we were asking around everyone, like, I got to find this guy's school. That's the reason I'm out here. I came out here to be able to train at his school. Eventually we got the address and the phone number, and we went to and so the first time I went in, I had no idea what to expect. I just wanted to go in and see if I could train. I didn't have a gi or anything at the time. And so I just went in and watched the class. And I think my first experience was like, wow, shit, this is the real deal. I'm at the right place. Was literally 5 minutes within walking in, there's a training session going on, a sparring session. And within 5 minutes, next thing I know is I see a guy getting up, holding another guy's legs, shaking his legs, trying to get him to wake up because he choked him out. And I'm like, yep, I'm in the right place. So, that experience, I think some people would be freaked out by it, but I was so gung-ho for training. And like, yes, I want to learn how to do that.
Amazing. So what was it like coming up with Rickson? Obviously, I think, your circle is pretty wide now. We have a friend in common in John Frankel. And, obviously you're doing seminars all over the planet, and get to see the way different academies are run. What made Rickson's style different, and what made it like special to learn from him? Because obviously I agree with you, and 99.9% of the jiu-jitsu world, if not 100, agrees with you that he's the greatest of all time. What was it like to train with him, and why was it special?
I mean, man, the depth of knowledge that he has in doing jiu-jitsu, it's like, when you're training with someone that's been doing it as much time as he was doing it for basically his whole life, since the kids were 2 and 3, they've been on the mats and they've been training. So the depth of knowledge that he has is incredible, as in his ability to know and understand every position and know the details, the subtleties of every position and how each position works. That's one of the things they talked about, is he improved his father's jiu-jitsu so much. Like, he took all of Elio's jiu-jitsu and took a lot of it to the next level. So he was always refining it. And I think the big thing with Rickson is he had a very, very scientific approach to jiu-jitsu, in that he was always trying to understand how the techniques work and understanding what could create problems in the techniques and how to overcome it. And so, it took a really in-depth understanding of body mechanics and leverage, and basically taking that kind of knowledge of body mechanics, movement, leverage, and applying it to every single position to kind of see like how he can make things better. And, a lot of people say that his biggest contribution to jiu-jitsu is the understanding of the two elements of kind of weight distribution and connection, how to apply those two elements to kind of every position in jiu-jitsu. And so, I know that's a huge element that a lot of people don't understand. It's a term that gets thrown around a lot in jiu-jitsu, but without people really understanding what it means and how it applies to each position. And so both of those elements are kind of completely game-changing when you understand how to apply it into your game, or when you understand how to take it and apply it on someone else.
So that sounds it's more conceptual than technique based, right? So it's something that no matter what game you're playing, you could go and apply those concepts to any element of your jiu-jitsu, right?
Well, it's both. When you say conceptual, yes, it's an idea, right? But there's a way to apply it in each position, and so there's a technique for it also. Does that make sense? So yes, this is the idea of how to stay connected to your opponent so you can feel his movement, so you have the sensitivity, so you can react, so that when you execute a movement, it like affects him, it has a greater effect on him. And then this is how you go about applying it. And so there's little details that you can show someone to help them to be able to do it. So it's not just it doesn't become just an idea in someone's head. Okay, hey, try to be heavy or try to use your weight, which is so vague. And how does you telling someone to use their weight better, how does that help them? Right. But if you show them, okay, this is how you apply your weight on your opponent when you're in the cross side. This is how you make yourself feel heavier, and do this and do this. Take your knees off the ground, take your elbows off the ground, stay on your toes, lift your butt up a little bit. If you explain to them the technique behind it, then they can start to apply it themselves. And so, yeah, it's always both. There's always the concepts, right? The concepts are the ideas. And then it's how do we express that concept, which ends up being the technique.
Amazing. I think about that. I think that when these concepts that you're talking about, the techniques that you're talking about, aren't always something you can see when you see someone doing it, right? Like they are,
right.
They're tough to pick up visually, right? You have to feel it when it's being done. Is that kind of the concept that Rickson talks about invisible jiu-jitsu?
It's so yeah. So the term that he uses, invisible jiu-jitsu, is basically that's the idea, is that many of the things that he's doing, it's very hard to pick up on because you don't see a lot of dramatic movement. You don't see a huge shifting of his position. So visually it's hard to pick up. Now, for someone who's trained, someone who understands what's going on, if you've done it before, you can kind of see those details. And so that's one of the reasons I say it's hidden jiu-jitsu. When you've been doing it long enough and when you understand what the person's doing, you can definitely see, oh, this guy's elbow's on the ground. And so that's why he's not as heavy, or his hip is not, there's a subtle shift. Now it's subtle enough that it's happening, right? But if you're not aware of it, it's going to pass you by.
Right.
Hey, so a lot of guys, a lot of guys that are really great at something are not always a great coach, what was Rickson like as a teacher, as a coach?
So that's a great question, because like I mentioned before, his knowledge and his understanding of jiu-jitsu is so deep. It's crazy. I mean, there's stories and hundreds of guys will testify. Anyone that's been to a seminar, he'll come pull out black belts and he'll teach black belts how to do techniques that they've been doing for the last 20 years better, right? He'll improve like the bridge. That's always one he's really famous for reteaching people how to do more efficiently. So his understanding and his knowledge of jiu-jitsu is incredible. The problem with Rickson is English is not his first language, right? And so his ability to articulate sometimes is not the best. And so this is one of the things that a lot of people have mentioned to me, that they've gone to his seminars and they had a hard time understanding what he was saying or because sometimes he kind of mixes words up or jumbles words around. So I think that was even one of the issues or one of the problems when he started to release those videos. I know there was kind of a huge kind of disappointment with the first series of videos, is because the way that he was explaining or articulating the things didn't come across well to people. People weren't really understanding what he was trying to explain. But if you ever give Rickson a chance to put his hands on you and let you feel, and that's what he's exceptional at. If you let him do the technique to you, he can pinpoint all of the little details and all of the little micro adjustments that he's making. And, or when he can position you in a way, or, that's what he's really, really good at teaching. That's when his teaching shines, is the kinesthetic aspect of his teaching. Is he can get you to feel things and sense things and be aware of things that you were just completely blind to before. And he does that, he's really, really good at that. And that's one of the things he does at all of his seminars. He's like, hey, feel this. You always have him. He's always saying, feel this, feel how this feels, feel how this feels. Because a lot of times, his ability to articulate is not on that level. So I think that's where he's really, really exceptional. And that was a huge blessing for me, being able to train underneath him. We were all these kind of similar sizes. And so it was really easy for him to use me as a demonstration partner. And so that was always a huge value. I would always be able to pick up, I think extra details because he would use me as a demonstration partner a lot of times when he was teaching the classes, just because it was just comfortable. We were just kind of the same size and it was easy. So, I was always able to pick up a lot like, wow, he did that, or he made this little adjustment that he didn't necessarily explain or didn't necessarily say, but I felt it.
Wow.
I've seen you in videos do the same thing, right? Where you are teaching the people and then you let them feel it. Right.
Yeah. And that, like I said, when we're learning as a student, I try to as a good teacher, you want to appeal to the three kind of modalities of learning. Like every student learns differently, and like I said, the three ways we learn is by hearing, seeing, and feeling, especially with jiu-jitsu. And so you definitely want to help the students. If they can't understand, you want to basically make sure you're reaching all those senses, that they can hear what you're trying to explain to them to do, that they can see it. And so a lot of times what I'll do is when I'm teaching, I'll say, hey, look at this hand. Look what I'm going to do with this hand. And I'll snap to draw the eye to that, or draw their attention to what I'm trying to show them. Look at my foot. I want you to see my foot and look what I'm doing with my foot. Because in the grand scheme of things, when you're watching someone teach a technique, if they're not pointing out all these little details of look what my foot is doing, look what my hand is doing, look what this is doing, sometimes their focus is somewhere else and they miss that. And then of course the feeling thing, so that's, when you break everyone up into groups and when I go around the room, that's always a huge thing, is like, hey, let me show you how it feels so that you can replicate it. And a lot of times I'll let them do it to me, and I want to make sure that it feels the same way. So that's a huge element, that they can replicate that kinesthetic feel.
And I've also watched a lot of your videos, your instructional videos, and you talk about that a lot. You're always communicating with the person that you're teaching the technique to. Like you feel that. Okay. Like I think it was a guillotine. You were teaching a guillotine and talking about how the legs push away and how it's so inefficient the way that most BJJ guys do. They just push the legs away instead of pinching. Mm-hmm. And talking about the connection, and that's something that keeps on coming up over and over when I watch different things that you're doing. How has that affected? So have you taken what you learned from Rickson? Have you changed a lot of the way that you teach and taking advantage of kind of modern, instruction methodologies, like you're talking about the three different ways of that people learn? Or are you pretty much kind of saying, hey, I'm going to keep the jiu-jitsu pure and I'm going to change the teaching style?
Definitely a huge, influence. Rickson was always a huge influence on me. And that's definitely where something that he really emphasized and something that he was really big on, because I think that was always the way for him to have the greatest impact, is helping the students feel what he was trying to teach. And so that's something that really resonated with me, like, hey, make sure that they can feel it. But also I think my English is a little bit better than his, and my ability to articulate is a little bit better. And so, when it comes to teaching style, there's definitely the things that I felt were really great about his teaching, I obviously try to replicate. And then the areas where I felt that were a little bit weak, I've tried to say, hey, let me see if this, this works better. Or let me see if this teaching this way or using this type of approach to teaching will help students learn a little bit quicker. So for example, like one of the things that Rickson used to do a lot in class is he would teach a technique from one position, and then he would go to another position and show another technique, and then show another technique from another position. So things were a little bit disjointed. You would get each technique and get really, really in depth on how each technique works and all of the little details that help make it work really, really efficiently. And then you would jump to another technique, and you would see like in depth the details of that technique. And for me, I think with jiu-jitsu, the way that jiu-jitsu is trained, everything is so interconnected. And so one of the things that I do when I teach is I try to connect everything so that the students can see, hey, from this situation, things can go this way or this way. And from there, they go this way or this way, because instead of leaving it for the students to have to figure that out for themselves, what comes next or what can happen from here, you give them that information already and say, okay, from this situation, when you're doing this, your opponent might be able to do this, or they might be able to do this, or they might be able to resist or defend by doing this. And then this is how you'll deal with it. So I think that's really, really important. And that's something that I kind of just started doing on my own because I felt it was a better approach to help students learn. And so for me too, man, I'm always trying to become a better teacher. I'm never set in my ways. I'm always trying to see like, hey, is there a different approach? Like that's one of the things every time I go and teach a seminar, I actually go back and take some time to myself after the seminar and think to myself, well, okay, where were the students struggling? Where were there a lot of questions coming up? What could I have done better to explain it so that there's less confusion? Or if a bunch of people had a ton of questions about a similar thing, I'll say, hey, I need to remind myself that next time I teach this topic, that I do a better job of explaining this in more detail because there was a lot of confusion here. So I'll actually go back through my head and do a checklist and kind of reassess my performance, because I think for any of us that are really passionate about what we do, we always want to do the best job that we can. And that's always been a great tool for me, is kind of just going back through the seminar in my mind. And also the cool thing is I get to watch these seminars because I usually have a camera guy with me recording everything and seeing where was there confusion or what could I have done better to help the students, in that short period of time we have together.
So it's the reason I ask is, obviously the questions about Rickson are natural, right? Like I'm sure whatever conversations and podcasts you've done, the topic of Rickson comes up.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
In your own light, you are world renowned for, your expertise, your technical ability and your ability to teach jiu-jitsu. And so, the folks that know you, like Dave and John Frankel, I asked them about you before we went on the podcast. I was like, so what's, and their overwhelming response, like, it's just different. Like training with Henry is just different. And I know that's a difficult question to ask, and you kind of, it's an opportunity. Like, it feels like you're bragging about yourself, but is it your philosophy? Is it your approach to training? Is it something different altogether, or all of the above? Like, what do you think?
Gosh,
I know that's not an easy question.
Yeah, it's so vague, right? It's just different, and then the next question is, how is it different? I'm not quite sure, why people have that experience of it being so different. I know I put a lot of time into my teaching. I put a lot of time and energy and effort into my teaching. I have to give credit always back to Rickson. He passed on so much incredible knowledge to me, over the years that, I would never have had the knowledge or the mindset to even break down techniques. That was like a huge thing I took from him, is seeing how he would analyze even new positions, new things that would come out that he had never seen before, and see how he could develop an understanding in a very quick period of time, in a very short period of time, understanding the technique and sometimes even improving on the technique that he just learned. I think maybe what is so different that a lot of people experience is a lot of my teaching focuses on the fundamentals, the basics, and things that people have already been doing for years and years and years, and things that people in their mind have already said, this is the way that it's done. I've been doing it for 20 years, and this is how I know how to do it, and this is what everyone else teaches. And then what I do is I come along and I show them one or two or three different adjustments or details that changes everything. And so now the thing that was used to be the norm for them, or this is the normal way of doing it, this is what I've done for, these are all techniques that people already know, now become different. There's a different way of doing it, which increases the efficiency of the technique by 20, 30, 40%.
And that's huge, especially with the fundamentals. Everything starts with the fundamentals. You might go to a crazy guard, or you might, invert and do all that stuff, but it starts with the closed guard. So if you can make your closed guard better, it would have that very high level of efficiency impact on your jiu-jitsu, right?
Yeah. Well, I think, when you're doing any sport or any physical activity, it always comes back to the fundamentals, mastering the fundamentals. Look at the best boxers in the world, the best basketball players in the world, what are they doing? They're drilling their fundamentals every single day. You look at Floyd Mayweather, who's considered one of the greatest boxers of our generation. He's still practicing his jab, right? He doesn't go, okay, I know the jab already. Let's get fancy and let's do some other stuff, right? He's still, there's stories about Kobe Bryant. he would show up 2 hours before Lakers practice, and he would be dripping wet with sweat by the time the rest of the team would show up. There's stories and legends about how hard of a worker he was. He would sit there and do free throws for 2 hours, or he would sit there. And that's, I think, one of the beefs that he always had with Shaq being a horrible free throw guy. And they would lose so many games because, everyone knows foul Shaq, and he's not going to make the free throws. Kobe was one of those guys that would show up and do layups for 2 hours. So it's just one of those things where I don't think you can ever get good enough at the fundamentals. And like anything, things that you don't practice, you end up getting rusty on. You talk to world champions at shooting, they're still focusing on their breath and their trigger pull and all the. So I think with everything in life, sports, physical activities, it always goes back to kind of not only mastering the fundamentals, but staying sharp with the fundamentals.
Right.
How many hours? You put in a lot of hours back in the day when you first started, I heard, right? Like you were at the academy open to close.
Yeah. I don't even know. I think weekly, when I thought about it in my head, the schedule back then, because that was pretty much the thing. When I moved to California, I didn't have any friends. I didn't know anyone. I didn't have any distractions. So I was basically showed up at the school first thing, and that's what I came for. I moved to California to train. And so I would show up in the morning when the school opened up at like 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning, and then be there till like 7 or 9 o'clock at night. And so I think when I was doing the weekly numbers, it was like something like 60 hours a week or something like that. Something, pretty crazy.
It's a long week.
Huh?
It's a long.
Yeah. And that's the thing is for me, it was just going there. And of course I would try to train as many classes as I can. Sometimes I do 5 classes a day. And then some days, I would just, my body be broken down, and I would take a 2 or 3 days off, but I would still show up to the academy and watch the classes. So, learning doesn't have to be just the physical aspect of training, but getting it into your mind, watching training, watching people train, seeing how people are doing things, visualization. There's so many coaches that talk about how powerful a tool visualization is for learning and getting better. And I think in jiu-jitsu, people, just don't have that world-class coaching, and the funds haven't been implemented in jiu-jitsu to really take the training and everything to the highest levels like you have it in football and all these other sports where the money's just massive. But we can take lessons from all of these world-class coaches and say, hey, these are the guys that have had incredible funding, incredible success, creating championship athletes. What are the tools they're using, and how are they training their athletes? And can we take any of these lessons and implement it into our own training to help our own students?
Yeah, and I think that's where kind of the focus on the fundamentals becomes key, because like you said, it's true in any professional sport. The most well-conditioned and expert athletes out there are doing that. They're working on those fundamentals. It reminds me of watching Hodger come out of retirement to compete. It's like nothing that a blue belt doesn't know from a technical standpoint. Like, hey, it's like you choke like this, or you get on the back, and you know what I mean? And I think that is something that separates you from other, there's a lot of sport jiu-jitsu academies out there that are focused on going to IBJJF competitions and winning in the gi with, I think and I don't want to speak for you, but the way you learned jiu-jitsu was probably a little bit different, that there was more of a martial impact to the way that you learned Rickson's jiu-jitsu.
Yeah. It was a different time, right? Back when I first started training, the IBJJF, they weren't doing international tournaments. There was, we used to have tiny tournaments, like, in a college wrestling room, right? You didn't have these massive events. Competition was kind of an afterthought to training. So what happened was the training always came first. And back then, the whole focus of jiu-jitsu was, how do we establish to the world that jiu-jitsu is the most powerful single martial art, right? And that was the whole purpose for the original UFCs, right? Is like, let's take martial artists from different styles, put them in a cage together with no time limit and no weight divisions, no time limit, no rules pretty much. And let's see which guy can do the best with their specific art form. And then after Royce ended up winning, the first few UFCs, he won the first one, the second one, the third one he pulled out, he won the fourth one. After that, it became pretty obvious that you need to understand how to train, how to be effective on the ground if you're going to survive. And so what happened after that is it became MMA, right? Everyone started doing, but back when I was training, there was still that question, is jiu-jitsu the best? And during those days, there were challenge matches. So that was it was still very alive and well. And so, I talked to all my friends that are kind of old school guys. I was just hanging out. One of my best friends is Scottie Nelson, who started On the Mat. And, that was the first kind of, him and Gumby started, that was kind of the first kind of jiu-jitsu website. And, we were talking about back in the day, all the guys that used to come into Half Gracie's, we just share stories about all the fights that used to happen, guys that would come in from different martial arts that would want to fight. And so that's kind of the mindset we always had to be prepared for, is like on any given day, some guy could come into the gym saying, I want to fight. And they would ask one of the students, and there was a big chance at my school it was going to be me, because I was there all the time, training all the time. You need to fight this guy and show him our stuff works. And so for me, and you know what the first thing they would always say to me when they would call me to fight, they would say, take your gi off. That was my instructor, would say, take your gi off. And we would square up on the mats, a t-shirt or no shirt or whatever, and we would just get down on the mats. And so the whole idea of using grips or fighting asking this guy who's a kickboxer or a kung fu guy, hey, put this gi on before we fight, that just didn't exist, and it was not like, okay, I gotta, see if I can take him down and get 2 points. That was just completely not even in my mindset.
You weren't fighting for an advantage?
There was no ref there giving, I wasn't holding position and looking up for points or looking. So I just, at that time, the culture of jiu-jitsu was so different. And nowadays, I think one of the ways that a lot of schools market themselves and do well, because it's become such a huge business now, is to show how many champions they have and show how well they do in tournaments, which is great. And I'm certainly not against competition at all, but I'm very much of the mindset that first and foremost, what we do is a martial art, and it was always intended to be a martial art, and it can be practiced in a safe environment, and you can compete against other people as a sport when you create certain rules and systems to make it competitive. But first and foremost, I think all of jiu-jitsu is always marketed as a self-defense art. No matter what school you go to, they always market themselves as, hey, this is an effective form of self-defense. So let's be honest with the students and teach them that and make sure that they're getting that, where a lot of the stuff that's being taught nowadays, I think can get people seriously hurt or injured if they were trying to use it in a self-defense environment. So even for people, if you want to teach your students like competition style jiu-jitsu or then I think there needs to be a certain level of honesty and integrity that goes along with it. Like, hey, just so you know, this is not going to help you in a street fight, but we do this for competition. And so students aren't misled, because a lot of times what happens is a student goes into the school, they say, wow, man, I heard so much about jiu-jitsu, and that guy Royce Gracie was beating everyone up with it. And, I know that all the guys in the UFC do jiu-jitsu or they train some type of jiu-jitsu. That's what I want to learn, And then when they go there to learn, they put all of their faith in the instructor, that the instructor is going to be teaching them these things. And then next thing they know, they're playing some type of like crazy lasso guard, right?
Flying guard pull.
Switch, right? Sometimes where people are like saying, hey, you can learn self-defense, but then they just go straight to the sport jiu-jitsu lapel guard type thing or something.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, who knows? I don't think a lot of times necessarily the instructor is trying to be deceitful or trying to. I think a lot of times what they're doing is they're trying to pass on what they know. But there's a certain level of accountability that you have to take too, and responsibility that each instructor has to take in taking a look at themselves and saying, hey, you know, if I have a student that comes in, they want to learn how to defend themselves on the street, is what I'm showing them going to help them stay safe? Is it going to serve what they're here for? Or should I tell them, hey, listen, you know, yeah, I know I would love to take your money, but I think going to this other school would probably serve you better if that's what your main focus is.
Right.
So it's funny that you bring up Scottie Nelson, because I think I attribute this quote to him anyway. I don't know. I'm pretty sure he said it, but I remember seeing him a long time ago in a video say, Jiu-Jitsu was developed to beat all the other martial arts, and then modern Jiu-Jitsu is like designed to beat Jiu-Jitsu.
I know, he stole that from me. That was what I told him, and then he is quoted as saying that. Absolutely.
I'm gonna start attributing that to you.
So that's what I, you know, that's, you know, we're such good friends. We talk about jiu-jitsu all the time, and even though his life has kind of gone in a different direction now, you know, it's still his passion, and so it always goes back to those first days of the UFC and how we originally used to train. Like when we used to train, it was, how do we train to beat a kung fu guy, a karate guy, a judo guy? How do we develop ourselves to be able to beat all these martial arts and try to understand what they're doing, and how do we develop a system to be able to overcome that? Where nowadays jiu-jitsu practitioners are only training to beat other jiu-jitsu practitioners, right? That's the whole competition, and, oh, this guy's got this grip, and so you see, like, you know, back in the day, it was very, very common that we would train with strikes. And I think nowadays in most schools, that's very rare, which is sad. Back in the day, you know, there were a handful of schools all across the country. That's why I had to move from Oklahoma to California to learn jiu-jitsu. You couldn't find it in Oklahoma. Or anywhere close to there, you know. Carlos Machado didn't even come to Dallas until a few years after I would have moved to Dallas if Carlos was down there. If there was someone closer, Dallas is like 2 hours away from Oklahoma City, 2.5 hours away from Oklahoma City. But at the time, he was still in California. So I had to move to California to learn, halfway across the country, to learn jiu-jitsu. So yeah, I mean, it just wasn't available. There was a handful of schools. And back then it was always still that mindset, you know. The UFC hadn't transitioned into MMA yet. It was still, what is the best martial art? And what's crazy about those days, I think people forget how crazy it was back then. You had to fight 3 guys in one night to win.
Insanity. Right?
Nowadays, you have gloves. Nowadays, there's rounds. You know, back then it was no time limit. You could fight for 15 minutes straight, 20 minutes straight, and no weight divisions and no gloves. And if you guys remember, there's a really famous match. Strikes to the groin were allowed.
Right.
Keith Hackney and Joe Son, right? You
could headbutt, right? You could do all kinds of crazy elbows. And so it was a completely different world back then, the expression of the art, and what we were trying to achieve back then with jiu-jitsu. Once it established itself, then everyone's like, oh, jiu-jitsu is the best. And then what happened was, you know, over time, people stopped challenging. Those challenge matches kind of dwindled down, and everyone started learning jiu-jitsu. And so it's kind of, I feel that in a sense, it's kind of lost that mindset of the practical effectiveness of jiu-jitsu for a street fight. And one of the arguments I always hear is like, oh, well, if you have one of the Mendez brothers or one of these competition guys, they could do really, really well in a street fight. And absolutely, of course, they're going to develop the skill, and they know how to move their body, and they're physically tough from all the years of training, and they're mentally tough from going through the training. But could you put them into an MMA world and have them do well? Well, probably not. I mean, there's a lot of guys, there's a lot of really, really well-known, really amazing jiu-jitsu competitors that tried to transition into MMA that didn't do well. I mean, Marcelo Garcia, Andre Galvo, Saulo. I mean, these guys are the greatest in the world of jiu-jitsu competition, right? When you talk about the best competitors in jiu-jitsu, I mean, those names, Saulo, Ribeiro, Marcelo, those guys are always considered the GOATs. But when you look at their performance in MMA, when you change things up, with striking, their experience and their performance, it wasn't so well.
Yep. I was going to say, just to contrast that, I mean, we've talked to Chris Howder, and we've spent a lot of time with him, and he says, as long as there are games, there will be people that are bending the rules to win the game, right? And that in competition jiu-jitsu, it's a different scenario, right? And so winning the game means something different than winning the fight. And the folks you're talking about, obviously they are some of the greatest in jiu-jitsu ever, but it's a different game. And so if you didn't come up playing that game, you're actually changing from what you have traditionally done to adapt it to do something else, as opposed to saying, this is exactly what I've always done.
Yeah. And like people should, these quotes don't get shared enough, but like Saulo said, he's a black belt and world champion in jiu-jitsu, but when it came to MMA and fighting, he's a white belt. Jorge Gracie said like 30% of the jiu-jitsu that he does, in competition works for MMA. So a lot of these guys that tried to transition over felt like they had to start from the beginning again or start at a huge disadvantage, when it doesn't have to be that way, or it shouldn't be that way, But again, like I said, that's type of training, when you talk about jiu-jitsu being uncomfortable, right? And making yourself uncomfortable, putting yourself in uncomfortable situations, when you add striking to the mix, that multiplies it by 10. And so, if you think just hard training is difficult or mentally challenging, try doing it when there's punches and knees and elbows involved. That adds a whole new level of panic and uncomfortableness. Most people can learn to adapt and be comfortable with just grappling and someone grabbing your limbs and trying to twist your limbs. But when you're getting punched in the face 3 or 4 times before you can tap out, that's different.
And I think that's changed the dynamic of the jiu-jitsu folks that are now successful in MMA. Like we saw Damian Maia obviously be wildly successful with, again, by the way, fundamental jiu-jitsu, right? And now some of the different folks that you're seeing, folks like Ryan Hall or Gary Tonin, that are out there kind of really doing some, very advanced jiu-jitsu techniques and mixed martial arts and doing it really successfully. What do you think about folks like that are kind of changing the game and bringing kind of modern jiu-jitsu to the octagon?
Well, I think it's awesome. All the guys that are basically, obviously showing how effective jiu-jitsu can be so, I mean, I think it's great, those guys. But, if you even ask those guys, they don't train the same way. They don't train competition jiu-jitsu when they're going to compete in MMA. Right? They've had to change. I mean, I remember, so I was at my gym, Dynamics Martial Arts, and John Danaher was there doing a seminar, and I think Gary was in town, and he had come back from, he had come into Dynamics, and he had some boxing gloves with him. I'm like, oh, you're training. So, he's training with strikes because that's what he has to get used to and develop, and that's what he's going to encounter in those situations. And jiu-jitsu used to be trained with strikes. Jiu-jitsu used to be trained with punches, and it's not anymore, and so I think that there's a huge disservice to a lot of students because they're not being exposed to the things that they should be being exposed to in order to really learn how to express jiu-jitsu effectively in a self-defense situation where they need to protect themselves or someone they care about.
That's a great point. That's amazing.
Hey, can I switch gears for a second and go back? Because a couple of years ago, I got to train and hang out with this guy, Luis Heredia. And you trained under him for a long time, right?
Absolutely. Limao. I love Limao. He's an incredible teacher and coach. He's definitely was a huge inspiration to me growing up. So he was one of my instructors for the first 5 years that I was training underneath Rickson. He was the first time I showed up when I was during that break, he was a brown belt. And then when I had come back and had moved to California full time, he had gotten his black belt in between that time. And so he was one of the main teachers at the school. And so, man, he helped me so much and was just a huge inspiration and motivation for me for training. And then around 2000, the year 2000, he ended up moving to Maui and opened up a school in Maui. And, he's got a great life, amazing life over there. So, I love Luis Heredia, and he's a great teacher and helped me so much in my early years. I mean,
what was it about him that he did that was inspirational? And so one of the things I think with a lot of teachers is there are teachers that are really, really good at teaching and breaking things down and explaining. And then what you have is coaches, people that can inspire you to do more than what you would have normally done by yourself, or can inspire you and motivate you to achieve higher standards. And so that was one of the things that Rickson, for me, was an amazing teacher, but he wasn't a great coach, meaning if you wanted to do it, great. If you don't want to do it, no problem, right? So he wasn't one of those people that would push you to do more. He was just very, very, Rickson's always very chill. He's always like, no problem. He's just so easygoing. Limon was one of those guys that would motivate you, inspire you. Come on, man, let's go. Let's work harder. Like one of those guys that you'd want to quit, or you'd be like, you'd have 5 hard rounds and you'd be like, I need to sit out. And like, no, dude, you're not sitting out. So he was one of those guys that would inspire you. Like, man, let's go harder. Let's train harder. Like, oh man, if I don't show up to class tonight to train, Limon's going to be calling me and saying like, dude, where were you at? What happened to you? So one of those people that just helps you to become a better version of what you would have normally done by yourself. Does that make sense? Yeah, 100%. I mean, and he's not a big guy. He's a pretty small guy. It's a
small guy. And he did a lot of those challenge matches back in the day too. He can share with you the stories. And so, I mean, back then, he was like 145 pounds. So you see a 145 pound guy getting down and scrapping with dudes on the mat, and that's the crazy thing. Like, boom, it would be gis off, shirts off, and you just square up with a dude on the mat, and it would just be bare knuckles. So yeah, to see him, he was like a little pit bull.
Someone needs to get a message to him that Georgie Law in Portsmouth, New Hampshire said that Luis was small.
No, listen. You can't see George, but he's standing on a soapbox right now. Luis loves me, dude. Me and him are the same size. That's why I bring him up. Me and him are the same size. I read somewhere you got thrown into challenge matches like right off 2 months in, right?
Yeah, 2 months in, it was my first one. Take it that I was the amount of time that I was spending there training, and also being just 20 years old and young and just full of testosterone and gung-ho, all of those elements definitely helped. But my 2 months was probably most people's like 6 months, 8 months a year, the amount of time I was investing into jiu-jitsu. I mean, like I said, I was doing 5 classes a day most of the time, and then there would come a time where after like 3 or 4 weeks or so, I would start to get broken down and I would take a day or 2 off and just come and watch classes. But yeah, I was just going hardcore. But yeah, I was 2 months in. It was my first experience with a challenge match. And there had been, multiple challenge matches before, but it happened super early in the morning. One morning, a guy named Kung Fu Joe, who I owe a lot to. Guy, he'd been doing Kung Fu for like 20 years or 25 years or something in Jiu-Jitsu. He was it was a little bit out of his mind, a little bit like kind of a crazy dude that came in. He was throwing flying stars into this wooden wall that we had.
At Rickson's place?
Yeah, he was just out of his mind. And he'd come in, like, this was the third morning in a row he had come in and was watching the class, and he was kind of off to the side, just kind of making like remarks and being disrespectful and like laughing. And then the instructor finally goes, dude, you've been coming in here for the last 3 days and, you know, being disrespectful. He goes, what's your problem? He goes, are you here to fight? Do you want to fight? And the guy goes, yeah. And so the instructor that day, his name is Jason Krikorian, who was a brown belt. You know, and at that time, if you were a brown belt, you were like a god in jiu-jitsu, right? There was like 10 or 15 brown belts in the whole United States, you know? So he goes to this other student who had been training longer and was a lot bigger than me, this guy named Joe. He goes, Joe, take your gi off. You're going to fight this guy. And I saw Joe look up at him. We were all sitting down on the mat. I saw Joe look up to him, and I just saw like fear in his eyes. I can't, like, no, not me. And I was just like, I'll do it. You know, I was like 20 years old. I was like, what the heck? You know, I've been in a few fights. I mean, what's the worst that's going to happen to me? You know, took off my gi and we scrapped, and I just immediately clinched, took him down. He gave up right away, tapped out. And then Jason says, whoa. He's like, you're not allowed to tap just because you guys are falling on the ground. That's like Henry, who doesn't, you know, do stand-up. He doesn't train stand-up. That's him tapping because he's not comfortable on his feet. You guys are going to fight, you know, keep. And then he looked at me and said, once you guys hit the ground, keep going, you know? So he just tapped out, and I was like, you know, just being respectful. Whoa, okay. He tapped, he gave up. I'm off of him. But so the next time he was waiting for me to clinch, caught me when I was coming in. You know, it's so funny. I had long hair at the time, and my hair got in my face. So right after that is when I shaved my head to this. And I had this haircut for like 20 years. And then like a couple of years ago, I grew my hair back out, and then I shaved it again. But anyways, I used to have my hair long, but my hair got in my face, it clipped me. I still ended up clinching and taking him down. And then when I got on top of him, he got me in a headlock, and I was just cracking him. And then eventually I caught him in an arm lock a few seconds later. And then, you know, afterwards we had this conversation. He sat on the bench next to me, and he was just so depressed, and he basically said to me, he goes, man, he goes, I've been doing martial arts for most of my life, and I always believed that when the time came for me to get in a fight, that it was going to work. And he goes, you're just a white belt. He goes, man, I have like all these sashes in Kung Fu and ninjutsu. And he's like, I can't believe none of this stuff that I've been training all my life didn't work. And to me, it was such a huge disappointment. You could see it was like he wasted half of his life, you know, training in something, in this thing that he believed was going to work, and it was just not effective when it came down to it. And so that was such an impactful moment for me, because that was something that's always stuck in the back of my head. Like, I want to make sure that I'm doing something that, if the day ever came where I needed it to protect myself, defend myself, or defend someone I care about, that it's going to work. And that's why I've always kept this practical approach to jiu-jitsu, where first and foremost, it's about fighting. And then if you want to use it for competition, or use it for sport, or use it for anything else, it can be there. But you have to first and foremost know that if you ever need it to save your life, it's going to work.
Hey, would any of these guys like Kung Fu Joe ever sign up after?
So he did sign up. He signed up for a couple months right after. And that was the whole thing about the challenge matches. I mean, that was the whole thing about challenge matches back then. Is like, we're going to come, show you how ineffective your art is, and show you how effective our art is, and see how easily we can dispatch of you. And then you're going to sign up. So most people would become believers after that. Some people would just have their egos crushed and hurt so bad they're just not willing to change or shift. But for most people, you know, they're like, so Kung Fu Joe did sign up. He signed up. So,
I mean, you got to love the fighting spirit, man. Not anybody's just going to go in there and chuck throwing stars at Rickson's Academy.
Well, back then, nobody, I mean, that was back in the day. Nobody really knew. There was not quite the fame. Like, Rickson didn't have the name yet. He had done like the first 2 Vale Tudos in Japan, but hadn't started doing the prides yet. And, you know, it just grew and grew, and the Gracie name grew over time. But this is still very, very early days, where people were still very much of the mindset of like, oh yeah, those guys are okay, but I could beat them. You know, it hadn't been really like established yet.
And
Go ahead.
You talk about like the Kung Fu Joe. It was, it is a little sad. You know what I mean? For a guy like 20 years of his life spent training in an art that now he doesn't believe in. And I think that's kind of part of our responsibility, right? Is, there is inter-style, and we train with lots of different academies, and we go and we compete all that time. But it's also like, look, for anybody that's looking to learn self-defense, and it's like, people are crazy. Like, people are looking at George Dillman videos like, I can't believe that this guy can put 100 people in a room and teach them how to do no-touch knockouts. You know what I mean? Like, we need to like spread the truth, the good word of jiu-jitsu, and be like, you need to stop worshiping false deities and learn to.
Yeah, that's what's so crazy about martial arts in general, right? There's so much. It's kind of like religion. There's so much belief system around so many martial arts. Like this guy that's in China, this MMA fighter that's going around beating up all the old masters, right? I mean, man, that serves a purpose. You need to bring people into the modern world and really teach people what the truth is. What really works and what's really going to help you. And you have all these old Kung Fu masters that have been training their whole life. And you would think by that time they would have developed some level of mastery or expertise of whatever art they're training. Well, does it really work? And I think that was the whole purpose for Bruce Lee's expansion out of Wing Chun and him trying to develop the JKD system was, hey, let's keep what works and let's throw out everything else. And, a lot of these ancient masters, these teachers that had been teaching a specific style or system for so long were so against that. They were stuck in this mindset and the belief is this is our system, this is the way we do things. And with the belief that it's just going to work when you get in a fight because everything is choreographed. The training was choreographed, That's one of the things. So I don't know if you guys heard, I recently joined up with SBG. And I recently joined their organization, which of course John Franco is a part of, and me and John have become really, really good friends over the last few years. But Matt Thornton, who is the head of their organization, came from that background, and that's one of the things that he really, the mindset that he really tries to instill in all of the coaches in that organization. And one of the reasons why I feel so connected to them is because of that mindset of, we need to make sure that we're constantly searching for the truth of what works and the truth of what's going to be effective in an actual fight, in a real situation, and just being honest. And there's a certain level of integrity and responsibility that we as instructors have to our students, right? When a student comes to me and says, hey, I want to learn self-defense, or I want to learn this art jiu-jitsu, which I heard is so great for fighting, that I'm helping them with that and not teaching him these kung fu moves that if he ever were to use in a fight, he's going to get his ass kicked.
And that's Matt's philosophy behind calling it straight blast, right? Is to kind of pay homage to that, use what works, and if it doesn't, throw it away. Right?
Yeah, I think so.
That's awesome.
Hey.
So, sorry, go to George.
No, go ahead, man.
All right, I have a couple Rickson true, false, or I don't knows. So there's like a million Rickson stories out there, and I've heard a lot like through the years. I'm also pretty old, and so
how long have you guys been training?
I've been training since '99.
Okay.
So I'm really old.
How about you, George?
I've been training 10 years, but I'm older than you, Jay.
Right. So I heard the first one is I heard that that Horian originally tried to target Rickson to be the representative in the initial UFCs. Is that true? Or do you know? So
I was not there part of the conversation, but in my understanding, that was never the case, that Rickson was going to be the one originally in the UFCs. And I'll just share a little background, because from my understanding, Rickson was known to be a little bit harder to control, meaning he kind of had a mind of his own and wanted to do his own things and had his own ideas. And Jorge being the older brother, that's why they chose Royce. Now, the other reasons that they decided with Royce first and foremost is they always had Rickson in the back. So if Royce ever lost, they felt they could always put Rickson in to represent the family. And the other thing with Royce too is he was not physically intimidating as Rickson. And so that was one of the reasons, the first UFC, Rickson trained Royce in the first UFC and trained Royce in the second UFC. He trained him for both of those. And my understanding was that they never financially took care of him for training Royce for those events. Royce got a payday, and Jorge was at the time owner of the UFC, but Rickson never got any type of financial what's the word I'm looking for?
Compensation.
Compensation. He never got financially compensated for that, and so I think there was a little bit of a falling out. And so in the third UFC, he didn't coach Royce for the third UFC. He didn't train Royce and wasn't responsible for his training. And for some people, some of the people think that is one of the reasons why he didn't do so well in the third UFC, which obviously, like, you're dealing with a guy like Kimo Leopoldo who's outweighs you by 100 pounds and is jacked full of testosterone. Anyone's going to have a hard time dealing with an individual like that. But that was the story from the early days, that they had always planned on using Royce first and foremost, and that they would hold Rickson in the back. And that was the other thing too, is Rickson's got a family, he's got kids, and he's like, hey man, why aren't you picking me when I'm the champion of the family to represent? You should be using me. And so that's why he ended up going to Japan and fighting in Japan.
Right. I've also heard that Rickson has said that at some point he might release the Yoji Anjo video that he had from that day. I think the story goes that he sent it to Japan to prove that he wasn't a liar and that what really happened that day. Is there? All right. So what's your version? Like, what have you heard?
The video has been in his hands in a safe for eternity. It's like it's at his house in a safe, or it was always at his house in a safe. And he would pull it out to sometimes show like special guests at his house. Guys would come over to his house and hang out, and people would always ask him, and he would break out that like grainy VHS tape to be able to show people. But that never got sent to Japan. There was a bunch of members of the Japanese press that were there that day that flew in with Anjo. And so there were already pictures in the Japanese newspaper the next day of what happened to Anjo. So there's a bunch of documentation and a bunch of pictures and front page of the newspaper of his face just completely battered and bloody. And what's so crazy about it is Rickson ended up choking him out face down after just going to town on his face for a good probably 30 seconds, just cracking him in the face like relentlessly, and then there's a point where you can hear the guy's nose break because it was a loud pop, and Rickson just wouldn't stop. And even like Luis was there, and one of the things Luis always says is like in his mind he was saying, "Oh fuck, Rickson, like just stop, please," like it was getting to that point where guys were getting like a little bit sick because of like, oh man, he's just like putting it on this guy. He ends up turning him and choking him out. And there was always because I would show up in the morning at the school to lay out the mats. We had these fold-up mats that we would lay out. Those were our training mats, those old little tatami mats, because remember we shared the place with a karate school, so we had to pull up the mats at the end of the day and lay them out for training. And there was always this one mat with a giant blood stain on it. It was the stain from where Yoji Anjo was laying face down in a puddle of blood that never came out.
Unreal.
So that was if you saw the documentary Choke, those green mats, those old green mats, it was definitely the battleground when you were stepping onto those mats.
So I've got a weird one. So I heard that at one point Rickson went back to Brazil, and he went to Baja to train. And Nino was there, and Nino was doing the spider guard stuff. And Rickson still he did fine, but he walked away from that like, I should have been able to dispatch that a little bit easier, and came back a few months later. Like, he pulled spider guard, and the story is that he re-gripped the sleeves, pulled him up in the air, stepped through his guard, and armbarred him. Had you ever heard that story before? That was a far-fetched one that I had heard.
So I don't know about that story, but I know the first time that he really experienced anyone that was good with spider guard was Roberto Travin. And I don't know if you know who Roberto Travin is. His nickname was the Spider. So they called it spider guard. I think he was one of the guys that really created spider guard. And so I was there that day that Roberto Travin is one of Fabio Grisel's students, so from Alliance. And so I was there that day that Rickson was training with Roberto, and it was the first time that I think Rickson had really experienced spider guard, and he was having a very difficult time passing the guard. And you could see he was getting very frustrated, just being held and not being able to go either direction, and not really being able to do what he wanted. And so I know it was a really, really frustrating training for him. You could see it, and you can see, you have no problem telling when Rickson gets frustrated or when he gets, it's quite clear. And the next day he came back and he completely ripped through his guard and submitted him like multiple times in a row. And what's funny is me and Luis were having the conversation the next day, because we were just on the sidelines watching the training both days, right? Fabio had come down, and I forget, Fabio and Rickson were really close friends, and Fabio would come down for different portions of time, and he would train with Rickson, and all these guys have stories about Rickson's level, But I remember Luis turning to me, and I was probably just a white belt or a blue belt at the time, and he was like, "Fuck, bro. I could tell Rickson didn't sleep at all last night." And this is kind of, Rickson's thing, is that, man, his mind, the way his mind works and his depth of understanding of jiu-jitsu, he probably didn't sleep. He probably just went home and trained all night and tried to figure out the position and figure out what he could do. And one of the cool things he would always do is he would always take Rickson, who was small, just a kid at the time, and he would do whatever he wanted to Rickson, say, "Hey, try to do this," and he would give him different levels of resistance to see, hey, if my kid can do it to me, if it works, then I could probably do it to someone, and so he would always use Rickson as his kind of training partner, being smaller and weaker, to test out things for him to see, like, well, shoot, if Rickson can do this to me, then it works, because he's so much smaller and weaker than me. And that was, man, there I had so many jaw-dropping moments and kind of moments that were just epiphanies for me, and times in my training experience that were just like, I look back and were magical and so impactful for me. And that was definitely one of those times, was like, holy crap, man, he just came back. Like yesterday, he couldn't pass his guard, or struggling hard to pass the guard, like almost passed a couple of times and then recovered. And and they were going like at a good pace. This is, Rickson's in his peak. He was probably 36 at the time. And Roberto was just giving him a nightmare training. And then the next day he comes back and it was just game over, I figured out your game. I know what you're doing. And now,
it's over.
I got something for you. Yeah.
I've also heard that Rickson's level got to be really high before he passed.
Yeah.
He had moved to the East Coast and stuff like that. But everyone was kind of anticipating when he might step in the ring, and all I had heard was that his level was getting really, really high in jiu-jitsu beforehand. Super good.
I mean, we were training partners, so we were really close friends, and we were both supposed to get our brown belts at the same time. We were kind of both. He was better than me. We were training partners. I would probably one of the toughest training partners for him at the time. And he was a little bit better than me in that he was about 135 pounds and I was about 185 pounds. And he was just a nightmare to deal with. And that's, I learned so much from training with him. Like, man, his ability to off balance, his pressure at being only 135 pounds, his ability to put pressure when he was on top was just incredible, and so definitely he was a beast, he was a little beast. And so I definitely miss having him around, miss having the trainings.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. As much as jiu-jitsu, probably missed the opportunity of getting to see him develop and his effect on jiu-jitsu. Someone like yourself that grew up with him as a close friend, that's a tough one. That's a tough one. So, switching topics, dynamics. Traditionally jiu-jitsu guys, like they teach jiu-jitsu, and, your background obviously is more encompassing than just straight grappling. You know what I mean? It's grappling with strikes and really understanding how the martial component of jiu-jitsu works. It seems like dynamics is kind of a move from even labeling yourself as a jiu-jitsu academy as more of a mixed martial arts academy.
So I started Dynamics Martial Arts 10 years ago with Anthony Hardonk. And at the time, Anthony was a training partner with me. He had come from the K1. He had come from a K1 background. He's from the Netherlands, and they produce, all of the top K1 fighters for the most part. And so his method and style of teaching striking was very similar to my understanding and teaching of jiu-jitsu, meaning like he's just so detailed and understands all the little nuances and stuff like that. Like he came from the Voss gym, which is considered like created more K1 champions than any other gym. And so when we created that school, the main purpose of the school was to we want to have a high level of instruction in all the different aspects of mixed martial arts. And so we wanted to make sure that people really understood and had a high level of understanding of the striking. We brought Vladimir Matyushenko on board, and I'm not sure if you know who Vladimir Matyushenko is, the janitor.
The janitor, right?
Yeah, so he a lot of people don't know his wrestling accolades, but he was a 6-time Soviet national champion for wrestling, and he had beaten all of the top American wrestlers at the time. I mean, he beat Mark Schultz, guys that are legendary in wrestling. So his wrestling is just insane. And then also all of his experience in MMA, how to apply wrestling for MMA. And then of course I was the jiu-jitsu coach, having experience training with Rickson through the years and having been around Rickson and trained with Rickson also leading up to some of his fights. So that's, we just kind of had a very, very similar mindset of like, hey, fighting is evolving. We want to make sure that we have a school that can really teach students all of the aspects of fighting and also at a very, very high level, having high level of instructors to be able to teach every single aspect of it. So that was the idea behind Dynamics Martial Arts. And like I said, I just recently moved to Vegas about a year ago. So I ended up selling my portion of the gym. And I'm still very close with all the guys, and I'll probably go back there and teach seminars, and I'm still close with quite a few of the students there. But that was the whole idea behind Dynamics Martial Arts was Anthony at the time. Anthony was just getting ready. He was fighting in the UFC as a heavyweight, and he was getting close to retiring. And so we were like, what's next? And at that time too, in 2010, Rickson had just moved back to Brazil. So he had left the school in Crohn's hands. And so, he was my teacher, so he had kind of left back to Brazil. So, we kind of sat down and talked, and we're like, okay, well, what's next for us? Like Anthony was kind of coming off of fighting. He was like, man, I don't know if I have the motivation to really do this anymore. His passion was more towards teaching and creating, high level kickboxers. And my focus had already been teaching for quite a period of time. So I was like, well, that just kind of made sense.
It's interesting, the combination of the philosophies that you have here. One is kind of give jiu-jitsu back its true self, but the other is also let's not ignore what those other arts have to offer. You had your Kung Fu Joe experience, but you also have the Andy Hardonk experience where, like, if your hands drop, you're going to wake up 10 minutes later. So that's like a really interesting mix that you're like very focused on the martial application of jiu-jitsu, but also your eyes are open to these other martial arts that certainly have things to offer that are valuable for the martial artist.
Well, I mean, like one of the things, and this goes kind of back to Rickson, one of the things he said, I mean, you have to understand what other arts are trying to do if you want to be able to defend yourself against them, right? And really kind of fighting, MMA is really what fighting is about. It's kind of like the most pure expression of fighting. I think the closest that you can get is what MMA is today, where they're using their body in however way they need to be able to defeat their opponent. So I don't think a lot of people know this, but Rickson did some training with Sugar Ray. And one of the things that Rickson told me personally, he said, if you want to learn punch defense, don't learn it from a grappler. And he was explaining to me punch defense, and he was like, if you want to learn how to defend yourself from punches, you go to a guy who's been learning how to defend from punches for his whole career. So he had done some training with Sugar Ray. They did a DARE campaign together way back in the day. And I don't know if you guys remember what DARE was. I think it was like a drug awareness
education.
So it was like a drug, and it was him for the campaign. It was him, Sugar Ray, Steven Seagal, and I think Billy Blanks was the other guy. It was like, these four martial artists. So he got included in that campaign. I think that's where he met Sugar Ray, and I think he did some training with him. But I mean, it was that always stuck out in my head. Like, wow, okay, that's really powerful. Don't learn how to stand up and defend punches against a guy that's a grappler, because he's probably not going to know much about it, or he hasn't probably put so much time into it that he understands that aspect in depth.
Great.
So yeah, I'm always interested in martial arts, man. I'm always trying to learn, always trying to develop myself, always trying to see what else is out there, and then apply it to helping me become a better teacher.
Hey, so let me ask you this, man, because jiu-jitsu to me is very therapeutic, right? Like, and without it for the last 6 weeks, it's kind of like exposed, maybe holes in my game or something of life. And so I started practicing meditation and yoga, and mindfulness. And so it's been interesting, but do you practice those things or do you practice any of that?
You need to go to the 10-day completely silent meditation retreat, the Vipassana.
I don't know if I'm ready for that.
Nobody, I mean, unless you've done it, you're not ready. But dude, talk about an eye-opening experience, life-changing experience. Probably one of the most powerful things I've ever done in my life. 10 days of complete silence and going within your mind and going within yourself. You want to talk about self-awareness and learning about how crazy your mind is and all of these thoughts that are kind of going on in your unconscious mind that are kind of repeating themselves. It's pretty crazy. But yeah, I mean, I love meditation. It's such a useful tool, and it's such a powerful practice. It's something that I'm trying to get back into now myself. It's one of my goals for this coming year is to try to go back and do the 10-day silent meditation retreat again.
When did you do that?
I did it 6 years ago. 6 years ago. Yeah, probably 6 years ago. And it was life-changing for me. I mean, it was incredible. One of the most difficult things I've ever done in my life, but also one of the most rewarding things. And difficult meaning not physically difficult, but mentally difficult. A lot of times, I don't think people understand how hard meditation is. It's difficult, man. And especially because with the Vipassana technique, they have you focusing on your breath. And like any of us, anytime like for me, when I do something, I want to do it well. And so you're meditating like 12 to 14 hours a day, right? You're just to yourself. So there's no communication. They take your cell phone, no computer. There's other people at the retreat, but you're not allowed, they ask you not to even make eye contact because that can be a form of communication. And so it's really just about going within yourself. And, man, the first day of the meditation retreat, I'm meditating and literally like my mind would be on my breath. I'm just observing my breath. And literally 10 seconds later, I'm thinking about the craziest shit, like unicorns jumping over rainbows and a guy with a sword coming out. And literally my mind would be off for like, 2 minutes, thinking of like just wander off for 2 minutes. And then I'd be like, shit, I'm not meditating. And then you're supposed to bring your awareness back to your breath. And it was like that all day, the first day. And I'm just like, oh my God, this is so hard. And it's so frustrating because I'm like, man, it sounds so easy. Just observe your breath, but it's so difficult. And I think just with modern life, how our brains are constantly jumping around. Like, they say that with cell phones, your attention, shortens because you're constantly looking at your cell phone is, something else that's distracting you. Something else is distracting you. And they say even with like YouTube videos or commercials, they say like 15 seconds or 20 seconds is how long you can keep most people's attention nowadays. And so they specifically do like ads and stuff like that within that time span. So it was such an interesting experience, but man, to really that experience of going in 10 days and just going, gung ho all the way is the only way that you can do it. And that's why they actually have it set like that you actually have to commit yourself to 10 days because you won't get the benefits unless you really commit yourself and do it like that. You won't really get to the point where you're noticing the benefits and understanding, really developing the technique. It takes usually that much time.
I can't even imagine because, dude, 10 minutes. And my mind has thought a million different thoughts all over the spectrum.
George has not gone 10 minutes without taking a selfie.
It's crazy, man. I recommend, and you know what's so crazy about the Vipassana meditation, and I recommend it to anyone. It's free. And so you have to you sign up for it. There's a lot of times a waiting list, and there's centers all across the United States. And what's awesome about it is for the whole time you're there, they give you shelter, they give you a place to sleep, and they give you food. So you don't have to worry about anything except yourself and practicing the technique. And it's really about just personal development, and I'm huge in that. I'm really, really big in that area. I'm always trying to improve myself. And I think jiu-jitsu is one of the most powerful tools I've ever discovered for personal development and being aware of your body and your thoughts. But this was just like another level. And it's so cool because the whole thing is free. They offer it to anyone. And at the end, you can make a donation to the center if you feel that the course was impactful or helpful for you. And so it's really just an incredible thing that anyone out there can do if you want to get into meditation. I mean, and you really want to just commit and just go for it. The 10-day Vipassana silent meditation, I can't recommend highly enough.
It sounds amazing. I'm afraid of what I'll find in here, but
it's crazy. I had no idea. Your mind is so nuts and it's so crazy, and all these thoughts that are coming that we're just completely unconscious of. And so you kind of get to learn to observe them and see like, wow, my mind is crazy. And it's weird because you almost have an out-of-body experience and you start to realize that you are not your mind, that your consciousness is here and that your mind is, it almost seems like there's two people within one body. It's a really, really bizarre awareness and becoming conscious. It was like, wow, this is so crazy. I'm not consciously thinking these things, but these are the things that are coming into my mind. And that's not me. And that's not what I'm trying to think. And that's so it gives you a whole new understanding and perspective on yourself.
That's amazing. I got to check that out.
When I left, so I was going through a pretty dark time, and it was actually one of my buddies that recommended it to me to do the course. He was like, "Hey man, I know you're struggling. I know you're having some stuff going on in your life right now." And he goes, "I think this would be really good for you." And at that point I was like, man, I'll try anything. I'm like, yeah, I'm just kind of down in a hole right now. And whatever it can do to help me, I'm up for trying. And man, after I got out of it, it literally felt like the weight of the world was lifted off my shoulders. It was crazy. And we don't realize, I think most of us don't realize how much we stress out and we create our own stress about things that are insignificant in life. We make so many things in life significant that are not significant. And so that's one of the huge takeaways I had from that experience is like, when I was going in, like, I was like, oh my God, 10 days, I'm not going to be able to talk to anyone. What if someone dies? Or what if someone in my family gets sick? Or what if this happens? Or what if this happens? And after the 10 days, by the 8th day, I didn't want to leave. I was so at peace. And then by the 10th day, when I left, I didn't even want to look at my phone. I didn't want to answer any emails. I didn't want to, because it was like all that stress coming back into your life about, oh, I got to get back to this person. I got to get back to this person. I got to do this. I got to do that. And it's like for 10 days, I don't have to do anything. I don't have any responsibilities but me and myself. And it was very freeing.
It is, incredible the lifestyles that we lead now. A lot of people, there's varying levels of it, right? But the amount of stress that we put ourselves under and the responsibilities that we have in a right now ecosystem, right? Like there's no place to hide. You have a phone, you have email, you have wherever you go, you can be answering emails, texts, phone calls. Like there's never, this wasn't a good time for me. So people feel professionally like you're almost always connected and always having to respond and problem solve. And none of it is really true. There's no phone call that you have to answer. There's no text that you need to respond to. In this world, literally, if there's something you don't want to do, you can choose not to do it. But that concept is really lost with the lifestyle that kind of we're all brought into. And that really, it feels like it brings things back to center, right?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And it is like, you get a text and you feel obligated that you have to respond right away. When really there's no obligation. And that's, you hear about, one of the things with cell phones and people are sitting together having lunch and everyone's on their phones, So yeah, it definitely kind of takes that away for 10 days. And when you realize like, hey, I haven't had my phone on me for 10 days and the world is fine. Everyone's perfect. Nothing has changed. There's no catastrophe or anything like that. And life goes on. Man, you feel so much more at peace. You realize like, man, all of these things that on a daily basis that I worry about and I stress out about and I create my own stress, like it's all self-inflicted, right? We do it to ourselves. And so.
Amazing. We'll definitely do some research. I want to learn more about that. That's incredible. And I agree with you. That's my own lifestyle as well. I feel like I'm always connected, right? And it's stress that's unneeded. I mean, stress is obviously, it's a poison in your body. It doesn't feel good. It causes you to, even feel physically worse. You know what I mean? It's something that there's enough in life that you don't need to create more for yourself.
Yeah. Well, I think, what's crazy, like talking about this experience that we're all going through right now and this coronavirus and everyone being at home and one of the things, like a lot of people I know are losing their minds and going crazy. And for me, it's been actually a quite refreshing experience because it feels like everything is slowed down quite a bit. Like normally I'm so hustle and on the grind and on the go and flying out every week. And I got to do this and I got to do this. And I've been so focused on work, hustle and grind and get this done. It's kind of forced me to just take a break from everything and say, hey, you don't need to do any of this and you can't do any of it right now. You can't go teach a seminar. You can't do this. And so, man, I've had so much time at the house, time with my family, time to do work around the house, like what people used to do, like garden. Like I never have gardened in my life. And I've been landscaping my backyard and building a fence around my property and like doing all. So it's been so refreshing because it's created time for me to do things that I've always wanted to do, but never felt I had the time to do. And so, yeah, I'm actually been really appreciating this quarantine time. That's
the thing, man. Like it has led me to meditation, right? So I wouldn't be meditating or doing yoga if we weren't in this situation. And Jay, I'm telling you, like he said, it's a whole nother thing. Time, like 1 minute is you'd be like, whoa, like
seems like forever, right?
Forever. I mean, it's hard to explain because, you know, you think 10 minutes, no big deal. 10 minutes of focusing on your breath. It's impossible. I mean,
if you've never meditated, yeah, it's not possible.
Yeah.
It's not possible if you've never meditated. I mean, I don't want to say it's not possible, but it would be almost impossible for anyone who hasn't, you know, really brought their awareness in. I mean, after the 10 days, by probably like I said, when I first started doing the meditation, the first day of the meditation was like 5 seconds, 10 seconds. And then my mind would be off for 2-3 minutes at a time. And then I'd have to bring it back. And then it would be another 10, 15 seconds. And then it'd be boom, gone again. And then I have to bring it back. And then one of the things they say is don't let that affect you emotionally. It is what it is. Just accept it. And, but by probably the 5th or 6th day of doing it 12, 14 hours a day of just sitting in a room or sitting in a meditation hall and just focusing on your breath, I was getting up to a minute and a half. So not even that 10 minutes that you're talking about. This is like a minute and a half. And then what happened was my mind would wander off for 30 or 40 seconds. So much shorter period of time where I was able to bring it back to the meditation. And, you know, that's the thing, like anything, it's a practice where it gets better and better and better as you do it.
Well, I got the free time now. So,
so listen,
I'll have a bunch of shot, but there's more than you say two. There's almost 2 different people in there. There's like 6 or 7 in here. So we're going to have to keep bar fights from happening. But I'll give it a shot.
What I know that, I mean, nobody really knows what's going on, but you got plans to be on the East Coast? When are we all going to hang out, man?
Dude, I was actually just messaging, you know, Mike Zanga from BJJ Fanatics. So we were just messaging each other back and forth because they have a couple of my courses now that they are selling on the BJJ Fanatics website. And so we were just chatting back and forth over messages. He's like, man, I can't wait for you to come back out to the East Coast. I'm like, oh man, I definitely got to plan a trip. So as soon as things start to go back to normal, I'm going to plan out a nice, you know, couple-day trip to come out and visit.
We're an hour north of him.
You guys are Boston or?
We're an hour north of Boston.
Okay.
Yeah. So Portsmouth, New Hampshire is a beautiful area. It's like carved out of the seacoast. It's right before you get to the border to Maine. Place. We'll definitely do a seminar. Feed you some good East Coast barbecue.
Lobster.
Awesome. One last question for you. And you know, like for me, I feel like you are, and don't take this the wrong way. I mean this in a very good way. Like you are one of the folks out there that's kind of has to serve as a custodian of jiu-jitsu, a caretaker of jiu-jitsu for where kind of all of this is headed. And it's a big responsibility. And I think you're doing all the right things, you know what I mean? By trying to align people to where jiu-jitsu should go. What is your hope for what has become a lot of different things to a lot of different people as far as jiu-jitsu is concerned, like for the future, like where we take this thing, where would you like to see jiu-jitsu be 10 years from now?
You know, that's a good question. And it's a tough one to answer because for me, I mean, one of the main things I think is so great is that there's just so many people training nowadays, right? It's I think the last 10 years, it's been the fastest growing martial art. There's so many people, and I know just training, regardless of what your mindset is when you're training, regardless of what your focus is, it benefits people in so many different ways, right? Like George was just saying, it's like a therapy for him, right? A mental therapy for him. So whether he's training for self-defense or whether he's training to compete or whether he's training just for fun, like it serves him. It helps him to relieve stress. So for me, it's really tough to say this is where I want things to go, or this is because the art is not mine and it's not for me. It's for the world. It's for everyone. And so really, the main thing for me is that it's serving people and it's helping to make the world a better place, right? And I think it is doing that. It is certainly doing that in a way because I think one of the biggest benefits to jiu-jitsu that many people don't talk about is how it brings people together, right? We have this commonality and this passion. Like I would have never met you guys and had this conversation with you guys today if it wasn't for jiu-jitsu. And, I got to talk about meditation, and maybe you're going to try meditation now because of this conversation. So I think jiu-jitsu is serving its purpose, as in it's helping people. It's a tool to help people in whatever aspect of their life that they need it for. For some people, it's losing weight. For some people, it helps people to feel more confident. Like, hey, I feel like I can fight, or I feel more comfortable in a physical altercation, because I'm being physical. I have that experience of people being physically aggressive with me on a daily basis. And that's become now I'm a lot more comfortable with that. Of course, my focus and my mindset will always be to preserving that aspect of it where keeping jiu-jitsu as a martial art, because that's just because of the time, how I was brought up thinking about it, how I was trained. So it will always be kind of that for me, that kind of, and I feel there's a certain amount of truth to that, meaning that when most students come into a jiu-jitsu school, that is one of their main focuses is they're not coming in like, hey, I want to compete in jiu-jitsu. I want to come in and I want to do some exercise and I want to learn how to defend myself. I think that is a major motivational factor for most people that start with jiu-jitsu, start training jiu-jitsu. And so I want to be true to that. But like I said, man, as long as it's growing and we keep creating positive results with jiu-jitsu, that it's helping people throughout the world, you can't ask for anything more, right? And that this thing is, each individual will have different needs. I mean, I know a lot of people that, for myself included, most of my best friends that I have are from jiu-jitsu. So the friendships that I have in my life, the relationships that I have in my life right now, my main friends are all came from training. And I mean, what is, how important is that? And you can't put a number or a value on those relationships that have come into your life from that. So.
Right. That's amazing. And I always say, like, you don't know someone until you roll with them. Like, you learn more in a 10-minute roll with someone not talking than you do from talking to someone for a few hours. So you
can definitely feel their energy, right? You can definitely feel their anxiety or their aggression or their fear or I definitely think that comes out.
Huge. Well, Henry, George will obviously, I think he's got some more comments, but I have, this is our first time talking, but, obviously I've followed you very closely. I have a tremendous amount of respect for you and what you've done for the art. And I just want to say thanks very much for coming on. It's great to meet you. I hope this is a relationship we get to keep going, even though we're on opposite sides of the country. Look forward to meeting you in person when this thing's all over, and just thank you.
Yeah, well, I'll definitely be out east, and we definitely have to plan on getting together.
Heck yeah, sure. Man. Dude, no joke. Like, we've been doing this podcast for probably 5 years, I think, and your name has come up. Yeah, a while, and it's kind of like we just do it for fun. But your name,
99th episode, Wayne Gretzky episode.
It might be 100, I think, maybe.
Is this 100?
I don't know. I'm not sure. But your name, Henry, your name comes up all the time, and like John Frankel, and then
talks about you as well.
Yeah, and so I'm super stoked we got to do it. And big thanks to Dave McInnes he reached out and was like, "Hey, I know Henry. Like, if you want to have him," I was like, "Yeah, of course." So, man,
yeah. Thanks, Dave.
Right?
Well, to me too, man. I'm so flattered and so honored, and I mean that I get to share my passion with other people, and to be able to have an audience that I can kind of share my thoughts and ideas. So I feel really, really honored to be able to share time with you guys. Thank you guys, because I know it's time out of your day too, and time away from your families to be able to do this. So
hit me up, man. Hit me up when you make plans to come out. We'll hang out.
We'll show you a good time, I promise.
Awesome. I can't wait.
Thank you so
Thanks
much.
so much. Stay safe out there for you and your family, and we'll talk to you soon.
Yeah. You too, guys.
Thank you.
Peace.